Welcome to HardScript.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. She said it on a Tuesday night, not even looking at me. She was standing by the kitchen counter, scrolling on her phone, the glow hitting her face like she was somewhere else already. She said that I touched her too much, that it felt forced, like an obligation she had to tolerate. She said it calmly, like she was commenting on the weather. I didn't argue. I didn't ask what she meant. I just nodded once and told her that was fine. If touching her felt wrong, then I would stop feeling altogether. That was the moment something shut down inside me. My name is Daniel Harper. I run a small logistics company just outside Columbus. Nothing flashy. Trucks moving on time. Routes optimized. People paid. Problems handled quietly. I built the business to be predictable because life rarely is. My wife, Laura, was my operations manager. Schedules, payroll, vendor calls. She liked order. She liked control. She liked knowing where everything was at all times, including me. That night, after her comment, I didn't move closer in bed. I didn't reach out like I usually did. I lay on my side, eyes open, listening to the house settle. She turned on Netflix, the familiar theme music filling the space where we used to talk. I stared at the ceiling and made a decision I didn't announce. No more initiating. No more checking in. No more reaching for someone who had already pulled away. The next morning, she grabbed her coffee from Dunkin' on the way to the office, like always. She barely spoke during the drive. I focused on the road, the steady hum of the Toyota Camry, the same route I'd driven 1,000 times. At work, we slipped into our roles like nothing had changed. Meetings, dispatch updates, deadlines. Our best dispatcher, Mark, was already there, headset on, calm under pressure. He knew our rhythms better than anyone. He'd been with us for years. Trusted, reliable, always close. That afternoon, Laura suggested a Costco run after work. Old paper towels, cleaning supplies. Business and home blurred together the way they always had. We walked the aisles side by side, not touching, not arguing, not acknowledging the space growing between us. It felt efficient, clean, wrong in a way that didn't make noise. By Friday, she reached for me. Not dramatically, just a hand on my arm as I passed by in the hallway. Testing, checking if the door she closed was still unlocked. I didn't flinch. I didn't lean in. I kept walking. That's when I noticed her hand linger in the air longer than it should have. After that Friday, I started paying attention to the quiet gaps. Not the obvious ones. The small ones that only show up when you stop trying to fill them. Laura moved through the house like everything was normal. Efficient. Polite. She still asked about shipments. Still reminded me about invoices. Still corrected small mistakes like she always had. What changed was her timing. She stayed later at the office. Not dramatically later. 30 minutes here. An hour there. Just enough to feel reasonable. I didn't question it. I didn't ask who she was with or why she was late. I adjusted my routines instead. I stopped waiting for her to eat. If I was hungry, I ate. If I was tired, I went to bed. At night, she lay next to me scrolling through Netflix, the light from the screen flickering across her face. I didn't turn toward her. I didn't reach out. I kept my breathing steady and my hands still, like I was sharing a room with a stranger who rented the other half of the bed. At work, I watched patterns instead of people. Mark was always there when Laura stayed late. That wasn't new. He ran the evening shift, handled reroutes, covered emergencies. He was good at his job. That's why I trusted him. That's why I'd given him access to systems I kept locked down for everyone else. He spoke calmly, never overstepped, always deferential. The kind of man who blended into the background until you realized how much space he occupied. One evening, I took a longer drive home. I didn't go straight back. I stopped at Home Depot and wandered the aisles without a plan. Fluorescent lights, concrete floors, the smell of lumber and paint. It was quiet there in a way that felt earned. Nobody expected anything from me. I stood there longer than necessary, holding a box of screws I didn't need, just to feel time pass without being managed. When I got home, Laura was already there. She looked surprised to see me. Not guilty, just caught off guard, like someone who hadn't accounted for a variable returning early. She asked if everything was okay. I said yes. That was the truth. Everything was functioning. Bills paid. Routes covered. No arguments. No raised voices. That night, she shifted closer in bed. Her leg brushed mine. She waited. I didn't respond. After a moment, She pulled back. I felt the tension move through her body, sharp and contained. The next morning, I noticed she deleted a notification from her phone faster than usual. I didn't react. I just filed it away. By the following week, silence had weight. Not the kind that comes from anger or punishment. This one was structural. Like removing a support beam and watching the building stay upright while everything inside shifted. Laura noticed it before she named it. She started asking small questions again. Not emotional ones. Operational ones. What time I'd be home. Whether I'd eaten. If I needed anything from the store. I answered every question calmly and accurately, the way I answered clients. At work, she began hovering, standing just close enough to feel intentional. She'd lean over my desk to point at a screen, her arm brushing mine like it used to. I didn't move away. I didn't lean in. I stayed exactly where I was, eyes on the numbers. I could feel her waiting for a reaction. Any signal that I was still available to be pulled back in. Mark stayed steady. Same tone. Same posture. Same presence. If anything, he became more helpful. Anticipated needs before they were voiced. Covered gaps without being asked. The kind of efficiency that looks generous on the surface. The kind that quietly builds dependency underneath. I watched how Laura deferred to him more often. Not overtly. Just enough to matter. A glance before a decision. A pause that waited for his confirmation. One night, she came home later than usual. Not late enough to justify a call. Late enough to notice. I was already in bed. Lights off. Netflix paused on a menu screen I wasn't watching. She slipped in quietly and lay still. After a few minutes, she rolled toward me and rested her hand on my chest. Not desperate. Not seductive. Curious. Like she was checking for a pulse. I didn't move. My breathing stayed slow. Even. She waited longer this time. When nothing changed, she removed her hand and turned away. I felt the shift immediately. Confusion tightening into frustration. She wasn't used to resistance without argument. The next day, I drove to Costco alone. Walked the same aisles we used to walk together. Loaded the cart with the usual items. Muscle memory did most of the work. At checkout, I realized she hadn't texted once. No reminders. No additions. No check-ins. That silence felt different. Thinner. Less controlled. That evening, she tried again. Sat closer on the couch. Let her knee touch mine. Said my name softly, like it was a question. I acknowledged it without turning. That's when I noticed something else. She stopped bringing her phone into the bedroom. She started leaving it face down on the kitchen counter instead. By the fourth week, the house felt staged. Everything in its place. Nothing lived in. Laura adjusted to my silence the way she adjusted to supply chain delays or weather issues. She rerouted. She adapted. What she didn't do was stop reaching. She just changed how. No more direct touches. No more testing my body. Instead, she tried proximity. Folding laundry near me. Sitting across instead of beside. Watching me from the corner of her eye like she was recalibrating a machine that no longer responded to familiar inputs. I stayed consistent. Same wake-up time. Same route to work. Same calm voice. Same neutral presence. Emotional burnout looks passive from the outside, but inside it's rigid. There's no impulse. No reflex. Just function. At the office, the atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically. Subtly. Laura delegated more to Mark. Let him handle decisions she used to keep tight. I noticed how often they were in the same room with the door half closed. Never fully shut. Always plausible. Always deniable. I didn't confront it. Confrontation requires energy. I was conserving mine. One afternoon, I replaced my phone. Walked into Best Buy after work and bought a new one without telling her. Same model. Same color. I transferred only what I needed. Contacts. Calendar. Work apps. Everything else stayed behind. Old messages. Old threads. Old versions of me that still reacted. I powered the new phone on and felt lighter immediately. Like cutting a line that had been pulling without me realizing it. That night, Laura noticed. She always noticed changes. She asked why I had a new phone. I told her the old one had been acting up. That answer satisfied the surface question. It didn't satisfy the deeper one. She watched me more closely after that. Listened to my silences like they might say something different if she waited long enough. Later, in bed, she moved closer again. This time she didn't touch. She just pressed her shoulder against mine and stayed there. Waiting. Measuring. When I didn't respond, she exhaled sharply and rolled away. I could feel the irritation in the room, thick and contained. The next morning, she left early. Earlier than her usual Dunkin' run. No coffee cup on the counter. No note. At work, Mark was already logged in when I arrived. Calm. Focused. He nodded at me like always. Nothing unusual on the surface. But when Laura came in, she didn't go to her office. She went straight to his desk, and she stayed there longer than necessary. I watched it all without changing my expression. That was the day I stopped assuming anything was accidental. Once you stop explaining yourself, you start seeing everything clearly. Not emotionally, structurally. I noticed how Laura adjusted her schedule to match Mark's shifts more precisely. How their conversations shortened when I walked by, not because they were hiding something obvious, but because they were already coordinating without words. Familiarity does that. It removes friction. It creates shortcuts that feel earned. At home, she tried a different tactic. She became warmer in public spaces, laughed louder, touched my arm when friends were around, mentioned plans we might take someday, like we were still building towards something together. I didn't correct her. I didn't contradict the image. I let it exist without feeding it. At night, when the door closed and the lights went off, she turned on Netflix again and waited. I stayed still. The distance between us wasn't dramatic. It was exact. One evening, I came home early without warning. Not to catch anything, just because my day ended sooner than expected. The house was quiet. Laura wasn't home yet. Her phone was on the counter, face down, exactly where she'd started leaving it. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The behavior was enough. People who feel secure don't hide neutral objects. She came in 20 minutes later, surprised to see me. Again, not guilty. Disoriented. Like a variable had re-entered the equation unexpectedly. She asked why I was home so early. I told her the truth. She nodded and went to change, her movements tighter than usual. At work the next day, Mark took a call outside instead of at his desk. He stepped into the hallway and lowered his voice. When he came back, Laura was already watching him. Not with concern, with alignment. They moved through the afternoon in sync, handing off tasks smoothly, like they'd rehearsed it. I drove to Home Depot after work again, not because I needed anything, but because the space made sense. Wide aisles, clear labels, no ambiguity. I sat in the car for a few minutes before going in, hands on the wheel, breathing evenly. The Toyota Camry idled patiently, like it always did. That night, Laura reached for me again. Not gently, with urgency. Like she was trying to reclaim ground she felt slipping. Her hand pressed into my chest and stayed there longer than before. I didn't respond. She pulled back sharply this time. Turned away. I could feel the shift immediately. Something inside her moved from confusion into calculation. And I understood then that whatever was happening at work wasn't filling the gap I'd left. It was only making it louder. By the 6th week, Laura stopped pretending the silence was mutual. She started testing boundaries more openly. Not with affection, with presence. She'd stand in doorways and wait for me to acknowledge her. She'd ask my opinion on decisions she'd already made, just to see if I'd engage. I answered when necessary. I stayed factual. There was no edge in my voice. No punishment. Just absence. At work, the rhythm tightened. Mark's schedule mirrored Laura's almost perfectly now. If she stayed late, he stayed later. If she left early, he adjusted. They didn't announce it. They didn't need to. People who are aligned don't signal. They move. I noticed the small tells instead. How Mark avoided eye contact when handing me reports Laura used to review first. How Laura stopped CCing me on certain internal emails, then added me back later like it was an oversight. None of it was dramatic. That's what made it clean. One night, Laura didn't come home until after 10. No text. No call. I was already in bed. Netflix paused on a screen I hadn't been watching. When she slipped in, she smelled different. Not perfume. Laundry soap that wasn't ours. She lay down without touching me. Stayed rigid. Waiting for something I didn't give. The next morning, she was already gone when I woke up. No coffee cup on the counter. No Dunkin' receipt in the trash. That absence stood out more than any explanation would have. I didn't follow her. I didn't check locations. I drove to work like always, steady and unhurried. When I arrived, Mark's desk was empty. Laura was already in his chair, headset on, handling calls herself. She looked up when I walked by, held my gaze for a beat longer than necessary. There was something in her expression then. Not guilt. Not defiance. Relief. That was the moment it settled. Not as a shock. As confirmation. I spent the afternoon reviewing contracts and route performance. Numbers behave when you treat them consistently. People don't, but patterns still show. By the time I left, the building was nearly empty. Laura and Mark's cars were still in the lot, parked closer together than usual. At home that night, Laura tried to talk. Not about work. About us. About how distant I'd become. How cold. She said it like an observation, not an accusation. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her I was tired and turned off the light. She lay awake longer than usual. I could hear it in her breathing. That was the night she realized the silence wasn't a phase. It was a position. After that night, Laura became careful. Not distant. Precise. She stopped pushing for closeness and started managing optics instead. She made sure dinners were visible. Lights on. Curtains open. She'd sit across from me at the table and talk about neutral things, like shipment delays or vendor changes, as if we were colleagues sharing a lease. I listened, responded when needed. Nothing more. At work, the alignment between her and Mark hardened into routine. They no longer adjusted when I entered a room. They didn't need to. What they were doing had settled into something stable, predictable. That told me more than secrecy ever could. Affairs that hide are still fragile. Ones that operate openly have already crossed the line into comfort. I noticed Laura stopped her Dunkin' stops in the mornings. She started making coffee at home again, drinking it slowly at the counter while watching me get ready, like she was trying to reinsert herself into a rhythm she'd exited too quickly. I acknowledged it with a nod and nothing else. One evening, she suggested we do another Costco run together. Said it casually, like it was an errand, not a test. I agreed. We walked the aisles side by side. Same pace, same list. She kept glancing at me, waiting for something to surface. A comment. A memory. A spark. I kept my focus on the shelves. Efficiency has a way of killing nostalgia. At checkout, she reached for my hand. Not urgently. Carefully. I let my hand remain at my side. The moment passed. She didn't try again. That night, she turned on Netflix and chose a show we used to watch together. One she knew I liked. She waited for me to comment. I didn't. After 10 minutes, she paused it and looked at me. Really looked. Like she was finally seeing the distance for what it was. Not anger. Not punishment. An absence she couldn't negotiate with. The next day, Mark called in sick. First time in years. Laura covered his shift without complaint. She stayed later than usual. When I left, her car was still there. Alone this time. I drove home without changing my pace. She came back after midnight. Slipped into bed carefully. Didn't touch me. Didn't sigh. Just lay there awake. I could feel the tension moving through her, searching for leverage that wasn't there anymore. The following morning, she asked if I still loved her. I answered honestly. I told her I no longer felt anything. That was when she finally understood what she'd lost. Not me. The version of me that responded. After I said it, the house changed temperature. Not dramatically. Subtly. Like the thermostat had been adjusted a few degrees without notice. Laura didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She just nodded once, like she'd received information she didn't like, but couldn't dispute. She got out of bed and stood by the window until morning, arms crossed, watching the streetlights fade. From that point on, she tried repair instead of control. She cooked again. Real meals. Sat across from me and talked about memories instead of logistics. She mentioned trips we never took. Moments she framed as closeness that I remembered as routine. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I cleared my plate and went to the other room. Emotional burnout doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It simply doesn't respond. At work, she pulled back from Mark. Not completely, just enough to be noticed. She reassigned some of his responsibilities. Created distance that looked professional on paper. Mark adapted without complaint, but something in him shifted. He stopped volunteering. Stopped anticipating. The quiet confidence he carried thinned into watchfulness. One afternoon, I stayed late intentionally. Not to observe. To finalize documents I'd been putting off. Laura noticed. She hovered near my office door, waiting for an invitation I didn't offer. When I left, she followed a few minutes later. Mark was already gone. That night, Laura didn't turn on Netflix. She sat on the edge of the bed and spoke carefully, like she was choosing words from a limited supply. She said she felt invisible. She said she'd made a mistake. She didn't name it. She didn't name him. She waited for me to fill in the silence. I didn't. The next morning, I stopped at Dunkin' for the first time in weeks. Sat in the car for a moment before going inside. Watched people come and go, carrying cups and conversations that would evaporate by noon. I took a sip and felt nothing. No comfort. No irritation. Just temperature. When I got to the office, Laura had already arrived. She handed me a folder without comment. Inside were revised schedules and a proposed restructuring. It was efficient. Logical. Too late. That evening, I drove home slowly, letting the car idle in the driveway before going inside. Laura was in the kitchen, scrolling on her phone again. When she looked up, there was something new in her expression. Uncertainty. Not about me. About how long she could live with the space I'd left behind. Uncertainty changes people faster than guilt ever does. Laura started moving through the house differently, like she was afraid of making noise. She watched me the way you watch weather when you're not sure if it's going to turn. I stayed the same. Predictable. Neutral. I didn't escalate. I didn't retreat. I let the space do its work. At work, she finally broke her pattern. She asked to meet. Not formally. Just a quiet conversation in my office with the door open. She sat across from me and spoke carefully, like she was handling fragile inventory. She said she felt disconnected. She said she didn't know how we'd gotten here. She said she missed me. I listened the way I listened to reports. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I thanked her for being honest and told her I needed time. Time is the only thing you can ask for without owing anything back. Mark avoided me that entire day. Not out of fear. Out of awareness. He knew something had shifted. When people realize they were a substitute and not a solution, they tend to step back on their own. By the end of the week, he submitted a request for a schedule change. Less overlap. More distance. Laura approved it without comment. At home, she tried one last adjustment. She turned Netflix back on one night, picked a familiar show, and waited. I sat beside her, same distance, same posture. The screen filled the room with sound that didn't belong to either of us anymore. After a while, she turned it off and stood up without a word. The next morning, she went to Costco alone. Came back with groceries we didn't need and nothing she actually liked. She unpacked them slowly, glancing at me between items. Measuring. I made coffee and read emails. The house stayed quiet. That afternoon, I drove to Home Depot again. Walked the aisles without urgency. Bought a few things I'd been putting off. Small repairs. Functional improvements. Things that last. When I got back, Laura asked where I'd been. I told her the truth. She nodded like she understood something she didn't want to name. That night, she didn't try to talk. She didn't try to touch. She lay on her side of the bed, awake, staring at the wall. I realized then that the affair had already ended. Not because I exposed it, but because it no longer served its purpose. And neither did I, in the way she wanted me to. The end didn't arrive with a fight. It came in increments. Laura stopped asking questions altogether. She moved into a kind of careful neutrality, mirroring my tone the way she used to mirror my schedules. We became efficient roommates who shared a history neither of us referenced anymore. The house stayed clean. Bills stayed paid. Nothing broke loudly enough to justify a reaction. At work, the system corrected itself. Mark transferred to a different operation within the company. No announcement. No explanation. Just a quiet shift in responsibilities that removed him from our daily orbit. Laura didn't argue. She signed off on the change and never mentioned his name again. That told me everything I needed to know about what that connection had actually been worth. One evening, I came home to find Laura watching Netflix alone. Not scrolling. Not waiting. Just watching, like she needed the noise to keep the silence from closing in. I walked past her and went to the bedroom. Packed a small bag. Not to leave permanently, just to create a boundary she could see. When I came back out, she looked up but didn't speak. She didn't ask where I was going. I drove for a while without direction. Let the car carry me through familiar streets until they stopped feeling familiar. I ended up parked outside a Home Depot, engine off, lights dark. I sat there and realized something important. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't waiting for an apology that would make sense of things. I was done participating. When I got back, the house was quiet. Laura was asleep on the couch, the screen still glowing. I turned it off without touching her and went to bed. That was the last night we shared the same space without acknowledging what had changed. A week later, she asked what I wanted. Not emotionally. Logistically. I told her the truth. I wanted clarity. Separation of roles. Clean lines. She nodded like she understood that language better than any other. We started untangling things calmly. Assets. Responsibilities. Timelines. No raised voices. No accusations. Just closure done properly. On my last morning in the house, I stopped for Duncan on the way out. Sat in the car and watched the steam rise from the cup. I felt steady. Not relieved. Not victorious. Just aligned. Some people think power comes from confrontation. They're wrong. Power is knowing when to stop reaching and letting the silence finish the work for you. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.